The fastest way to learn who truly respects you is to give them a room full of witnesses and let them believe you have no power. The laughter started at 8:17 in the evening inside the grand ballroom of the Pacific Innovation Summit in San Francisco. 500 executives, investors, founders, and reporters sat beneath screens showing growth charts, product demos, and the Nexera Systems logo glowing 30 feet wide behind the stage. I was seated at table 12, quiet, gray-haired, and apparently forgettable, while my wife, Vanessa Whitmore, stood across the room beside Blake Donovan, Nexera's chief growth officer. Vanessa was 39, polished, beautiful, and dressed like a woman who expected cameras to find her. Blake was 45, loud, tan, and wearing the kind of confidence younger men mistake for authority. He raised his champagne glass and pointed at me as if he had just found the evening's entertainment. "There he is," Blake said loudly. "Vanessa's legendary husband. The retired guy who gets to watch his wife do all the real work." A few people laughed. I lifted my water glass and nodded once. Blake mistook calm for surrender. "Seriously, Rick," he continued, "how does it feel knowing your wife is the one building the future while you sit at home reading old business magazines?" The laughter grew. Then Vanessa made her choice in front of everyone. She smiled, touched Blake's sleeve, and said, "Be fair, Blake. Richard does not really understand this world anymore." That sentence did not explode. It landed cleanly, quietly, and killed something that had been dying for months. I watched Blake place his hand on the small of my wife's back. Vanessa did not move away. She leaned closer and whispered something that made him grin like a teenager showing off a stolen car. That was not professional friendship. That was not harmless attention. And it was not the first time. For 6 months, I had been collecting records, travel reports, hotel charges, calendar entries, expense approvals, emails routed through company systems, vendor meetings that never happened, late-night strategy sessions that produced no strategy. Blake believed he was humiliating an old husband. Vanessa believed she was separating herself from a man she had outgrown. Neither of them understood that silence is not weakness when it is paired with preparation. Across the ballroom, applause rose as another founder took the stage. Blake kept performing. "Technology moves fast, Rick," he said. "Hard to keep up when your best years are behind you." Vanessa laughed again, and that was the part one would remember, not his insult. Her laughter. I remembered paying for her graduate school. I remembered introducing her to people who opened doors. I remembered the night she got her first Nexera offer and cried in my kitchen because she thought her life had changed. She was right. It had, but not in the way she imagined. What neither of them knew was simple. The summit was funded by Nexera Systems. The executives in that ballroom answered to Nexera Systems. Blake worked for Nexera Systems. And through Whitmore Capital Trust, a structure Vanessa had never cared enough to understand, I controlled the votes that mattered at Nexera Systems. They were laughing inside my company. And before the next 24 hours ended, Blake Donovan would learn the difference between attention and authority. Most people think power walks into a room wearing a loud watch and a louder smile. Real power signs documents quietly and lets fools introduce themselves. 20 years before that summit, I had been the man standing under the bright lights. My name appeared in investor reports, magazine interviews, conference panels, and acquisition rumors across the country. I built companies, sold some, kept pieces of others, and learned early that fame was expensive in ways money could not measure. People who chase applause make emotional decisions. People who value control build systems. By the time I met Vanessa, I was already stepping away from public life. She knew I was successful. She knew I had investments. She knew we lived comfortably in Marin County, in a house overlooking the bay, with art on the walls and no mortgage on the deed. What she never cared to know was how the money actually moved. Holding companies, limited liability companies, long-term equity positions, voting rights, trust structures. They sounded boring to people chasing status, but those structures mattered when love stopped protecting me. Vanessa was different when I married her. She was ambitious, yes, but she was grateful then. She worked hard, asked good questions, and treated opportunity like something sacred. I paid for her graduate program. I connected her with 2 retired executives who coached her before her first Nexera interview. When she started as a junior operations manager, she brought home a $28 bottle of wine and said, "One day, I am going to belong in those rooms. I told her she already did. For a long time, I believed we were building the same life. Then the promotions came. The conferences came. The hotel lounges, private dinners, and executive retreats came. Slowly, the woman who once asked me for advice began correcting me in public. Then she began dismissing me. Then she began apologizing for me before I had even spoken. Richard is old school, she would say, smiling at younger executives as if I were a charming antique. The first warning sign was not Blake Donovan. The first warning sign was the way Vanessa started measuring people. Valuable people, connected people, influential people, people worth inviting, people worth ignoring. By the time Blake arrived at Nexera, she was ready for someone like him. Blake was not brilliant. He was polished. There is a difference. He knew how to fill a room, how to flatter up, how to charm sideways, and how to make younger employees believe noise was leadership. He drove a black Porsche, wore Italian shoes, and spoke about disruption as if he had invented the word. Vanessa loved the energy around him. At first, it was harmless enough to deny. Business dinners, panel preparation, strategy calls. Then came the late nights. Then the weekend workshops. Then the executive training in Seattle 6 months before the summit. Vanessa told me it was a 2-day leadership program. The program existed. Her full attendance did not. Company records showed she checked out after the first afternoon session. Blake's travel record showed the same. The hotel records showed both reservations continued through Sunday morning, with room service charged after midnight. I did not confront her. Men my age know the cost of confronting without proof. I opened a file instead. By the time Vanessa came home smiling and kissed my cheek like nothing had changed, I already knew something had. And once I began looking, the marriage I thought I had became a trail of receipts. Betrayal does not usually begin with a confession. It begins with a schedule that does not match, a smile that disappears too quickly, and an answer delivered before the question is finished. After Seattle, I stopped asking Vanessa where she had been. I started verifying where the records said she was. Over the next 6 months, a pattern formed with the patience of a slow leak. Blake's name appeared beside hers in places where it had no business appearing. Client dinners with no client reimbursement. Vendor meetings with no vendor attendance. Leadership retreats where 2 executives checked out of the official agenda early, but kept charging meals to corporate accounts. None of it proved an affair by itself. None of it needed to. A smart man does not build a case on emotion. He builds it on documentation that other people can read without caring about his heartbreak. One Thursday evening, Vanessa came home nearly 2 hours late wearing the same silver earrings Blake had complimented at a charity event the week before. She walked through the front door, smiling at her phone. When she saw me in the living room, the smile vanished. Long meeting? I asked. Board preparation, she said immediately. Too immediate. Honest people remember. Dishonest people perform. She went upstairs, leaving her phone on the kitchen island. A single message flashed before the screen went dark. Blake Donovan. Great night. We should be more careful next time. That one sentence told me enough. When Vanessa returned and saw where my eyes had been, her expression changed. Not guilt. Fear. Guilt belongs to people who regret the injury. Fear belongs to people who worry about consequences. The next morning, I contacted Margaret Hale, an external compliance attorney I had trusted for 15 years. I did not ask her to investigate my wife's personal life. I asked her to review possible executive misconduct involving Nexera personnel, travel approvals, vendor expenses, and conflicts of interest. That distinction mattered. Personal betrayal breaks a heart. Corporate misconduct breaks careers. Within 3 weeks, Margaret's team found more than inappropriate closeness. They found expense approvals outside policy. Vendor introductions tied to Blake's personal network. Entertainment charges with missing documentation. Meeting summaries copied from old templates. Travel upgrades approved by people who should not have approved them. Vanessa's name appeared often enough to matter, not always as the decision maker, but too often as the person smoothing the path. While Margaret built the file, Blake grew careless. At company events, he began acting like Vanessa was already his. He touched her elbow when speaking. He interrupted her, and she smiled. He corrected older executives, and she defended him. Once, at a private dinner in Palo Alto, he joked that Nexera needed less gray hair and more ambition. Vanessa laughed so loudly that 2 people looked at me with pity. I did not react. I paid the check, thanked the server, and drove home while Vanessa texted someone with both thumbs in the passenger seat. She thought I was too tired to notice. Blake thought I was too old to matter. That was their shared mistake. Because by the end of that month, Margaret Hale sent me a message that changed the entire scale of the problem. Blake had not merely crossed a marital line. He had crossed a governance line. And governance is where powerful men stop whispering and start signing. The discovery arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning, 3 weeks before the summit. Margaret Hale called before sunrise and said, "Richard, this is no longer just an internal conduct issue." Her voice had that flat professional calm lawyers use when the facts are worse than the client expected. Blake Donovan had approved or influenced several vendor relationships connected to former colleagues, personal friends, and one limited liability company tied to his college roommate. On paper, the amounts were not enormous by Nexera standards. In a boardroom, that would not matter. The issue was disclosure. The issue was procedure. The issue was a senior executive using company channels as if rules were suggestions written for smaller people. Vanessa's involvement was not as direct as Blake's, but it was damaging in a different way. She had coordinated meetings, defended questionable approvals, and forwarded internal notes that helped Blake justify decisions already made. In one email, she wrote, "I will handle Richard if he asks questions." I read that sentence 3 times. Not because it surprised me, because it confirmed something I had been avoiding. My wife no longer saw me as her husband. She saw me as an obstacle to manage. Margaret's final evidence package reached nearly 200 pages. Travel records, expense reports, vendor disclosures, calendar conflicts, messages between Vanessa and Blake that were not explicit but intimate enough to show judgment had been compromised. A weekend in Seattle, a hotel upgrade in Napa, a late-night room service charge in Austin, a deleted meeting titled Private Alignment that company servers still preserved. Blake had been arrogant. Vanessa had been careless. Together, they had created a trail that did not need my anger to look ugly. 1 week before the summit, I contacted Thomas Reed, chairman of Nexera's board. Thomas was 71, former Navy, former chief executive officer, and one of the few men in business who could sit silently for 5 minutes and make everyone else confess just to fill the air. I sent him the report through Secure Counsel. I did not include a personal message. I did not mention my marriage. For hours later, Thomas called. "How long have you known?" he asked. "Long enough to be sure," I said. "And your position?" "Protect the company. Then protect myself." Thomas respected that answer. An emergency board session was scheduled for the morning after the summit, giving outside counsel time to prepare and the audit committee time to review. That timing was not revenge. It was governance. The summit would place Blake, Vanessa, the board, counsel, and the media in the same city at the same time. Blake thought it was his stage. Vanessa thought it was her new beginning. Neither of them understood that every spotlight they chased was about to make the evidence harder to deny. Through Whitmore Capital Trust, I did not own every share of Nexera Systems. I controlled the voting authority that mattered. Board composition, executive appointments, major governance decisions. Vanessa knew I had money. Blake knew I was married to a Nexera executive. Neither knew I could end a career at that company without raising my voice. The day before the summit, Thomas sent me one final message. "The package is complete." I looked at those 4 words for a long time. Then I put the phone away and packed a navy suit Vanessa once said made me look old. By the end of the week, old was going to look a lot different to her. The night before the summit, Nexera hosted a rooftop reception above downtown San Francisco. The city glittered below us. The bay sat dark in the distance. And Blake Donovan moved through the crowd like a man rehearsing for a throne he had not been offered. He wore a midnight blue suit, laughed too loudly, and kept one hand in his pocket as if posing for a magazine cover. Vanessa stayed beside him almost the entire evening. Every introduction became a small performance. "You know Vanessa, of course," Blake would say, placing just enough warmth in his voice to make people notice. She never corrected the tone. She enjoyed it. She liked being seen with him. She liked the whispers. She liked the idea that people thought she had traded up before she had even filed for divorce. I stood near the railing, speaking with 2 investors who had known me long before Vanessa entered Nexera. They knew enough not to say anything. Men who have sat through enough board fights can smell one coming. Around 9 o'clock, Blake spotted me and walked over with Vanessa at his side. He had been drinking bourbon and feeding on attention, and the attention had done more damage. "Rick," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "Still hanging in there?" I looked at him. "I am doing fine." "Good," he said, "because these rooms can be overwhelming if you have been out of the game too long." Vanessa smiled into her wine glass. Blake continued, "You should be proud. Vanessa is finally around people who can keep up with her." Several guests went still. Even in American corporate culture, where ambition is tolerated and arrogance is often rewarded, there are lines decent people recognize. Blake did not recognize them. Vanessa did. She simply chose not to care. She touched his arm and said, "Blake only means Richard prefers a quieter life." Then she looked at me with the soft cruelty of someone speaking to an elderly relative. "He belongs at home more than at events like this." That was the clearest version of her betrayal so far. Not the hotel records. Not the text messages. That sentence. She was not hiding Blake from me anymore. She was using him to humiliate me. I nodded once and said, "A quiet life teaches a man to listen carefully." Blake laughed. "Well, listen to this. Nexera is changing. Some people are the future. Some people are just history with a dinner invitation." Vanessa laughed with him. I saw two board members hear it. I saw one outside council attorney glance down at her phone. I saw Thomas Reed watching from across the terrace with the expression of a man adding a final note to an already finished report. Later that night, as the reception ended, Vanessa leaned up and kissed Blake lightly on the cheek. It was quick enough for denial and public enough for insult. She believed nobody important had noticed. Unfortunately for her, several people had, including the chairman of the board. My phone buzzed as I stepped into the elevator. It was Thomas. "Be in the boardroom at 8. No delays." I read the message once. Then I looked back through the glass doors at Blake laughing beside my wife. He thought tomorrow would crown him. In truth, tomorrow would introduce him to the bill. The summit began the next morning at 8 o'clock sharp, and by 8:15 Blake Donovan was already acting like a man who owned the company because he had memorized a few applause lines. The ballroom was packed with analysts, venture partners, reporters, and executives from across the country. Cameras moved along the aisles. Nexera's logo pulsed across the screens. Vanessa sat near the front, smiling like a woman waiting for her future to be announced. I sat 2 rows behind the board delegation and watched the room watch itself. Blake took the stage during the leadership panel wearing a wireless microphone and too much confidence. For the first 10 minutes, he stayed polished. Growth strategy, market expansion, innovation pipeline. Then the applause began feeding him. He started improvising. "Companies reach moments when they must decide whether to honor the past or build beyond it," he said. "And I believe Nexera is ready for a younger, bolder face." Several people clapped politely. Blake mistook politeness for permission. Some people built great things in another era. We respect that. But respect does not mean handing the steering wheel to someone who no longer knows the road. Vanessa looked proud. That hurt less than it confirmed. She was not watching a colleague. She was watching the man she believed would carry her into a brighter social circle, bigger title, and cleaner version of herself. At lunch, Blake approached my table with Vanessa beside him. He carried himself like the crowd had voted him president. "Rick," he said, "you made it through the morning." I placed my napkin beside my plate. I listened. "Good. Maybe you learned something." Vanessa added, "Blake was excellent. You have to admit he understands where the company is going." I looked at her. "I understand more than you think." Blake grinned. "Come on, Rick. Do not make this awkward. Every company has mascots. You can be ours." The dignified retired husband who smiles for photos. The table went silent. A reporter nearby lowered her fork. One of Nexera's legal staff turned his head. Vanessa did not defend me. Instead, she said, "Please do not start, Richard. This is Blake's moment." That was the second time in 24 hours she publicly chose him. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and looked directly at Blake. "Enjoy your moment." He smirked. "I intend to." "Good," I said. "They tend to end faster than careers." His smile weakened, but only for a second. He still did not know. That evening, after the summit dinner, I returned to my suite overlooking the bay. 3 secure messages waited. Margaret confirmed the audit package had been distributed. Outside counsel confirmed the recommendations were final. Thomas confirmed every voting member had received the ownership file. My phone rang at 9:41. Thomas did not waste words. "Tomorrow will be unpleasant." I looked out at the lights moving across the Bay Bridge. For whom? For anyone who confused access with control, he said. Then he ended the call. Across town, Blake was probably celebrating with expensive liquor and cheaper loyalty. Vanessa was probably telling herself she had finally stepped into the life she deserved. By sunrise, both of them would still be smiling. By lunchtime, they would be blaming each other in a room full of witnesses. At 7:58 the next morning, Blake Donovan walked into Nexera's executive boardroom with the same grin he had worn on stage. Vanessa entered 2 minutes later, carrying a tablet and a paper coffee cup, dressed in cream silk and confidence. Neither looked worried. The summit had gone well. Reporters had quoted Blake. Investors had praised the energy. From the outside, their future looked polished. The illusion lasted 4 minutes. At 8 o'clock, Thomas Reed called the meeting to order. 12 board members sat around the table. Outside counsel occupied one wall. The audit committee occupied the other. No pastries. No small talk. No casual jokes. Blake noticed first. What is this about? Thomas folded his hands. Executive Conduct Review. Blake blinked. Vanessa looked toward him, and for the first time, I saw a distance appear between them. Thomas nodded to outside counsel. The screen lit up. Travel records. Expense reports. Vendor relationships. Calendar entries. Approval chains. The first slide was uncomfortable. The 10th slide was damaging. By the 23rd, Blake had stopped leaning back in his chair. Emails appeared next. Not private bedroom details. Nothing vulgar. Nothing that would turn the room into gossip. Just enough intimacy, coordination, and carelessness to show compromised judgment. A Seattle hotel upgrade. A Napa weekend coded as vendor development. A room service charge after midnight. A message from Blake to Vanessa saying, "We should be more careful next time." Vanessa's face tightened. Blake tried to interrupt. Thomas raised one hand and stopped him without raising his voice. Then came the vendor contracts. Undisclosed relationships. Missing approvals. Meetings that never occurred. Reports copied from older summaries. Blake's name appeared again and again. Vanessa's name appeared often enough to make silence impossible. The audit chairman read from the report. The concern is not a single mistake. The concern is repeated disregard for disclosure requirements and executive judgment. Blake snapped. This is ridiculous. Everybody knows this is how business gets done. Several board members visibly recoiled. In that room, that sentence was not a defense. It was an admission of attitude. Vanessa finally spoke. Blake told me those approvals were cleared. Blake turned slowly. Excuse me. She kept her eyes on the table. You said legal knew. Do not put this on me, Blake said. You were in every conversation. Vanessa's voice sharpened. Because you asked me to be. You like being there, he shot back. You like the hotels, the dinners, the attention. The room froze. He had said too much. Vanessa looked at him with open panic. You promised nobody would ever connect this back to us. Blake's face changed when he realized she had said us. Thomas let the silence stretch just long enough to hurt. Then he said, enough. Blake's breathing had changed. Vanessa's hands were no longer steady. Two people who had mocked me in public were now trying to save themselves by cutting each other apart in private. Thomas turned toward me. There is one final matter. Blake followed his gaze. Vanessa did the same. Until that moment, neither fully understood why I was sitting there. Thomas opened a separate folder and slid several documents into the center of the table. Before we discuss recommendations, the board will clarify controlling authority. For the first time since I had known him, Blake Donovan looked afraid. The first page showed the ownership structure. The second showed trust agreements. The third showed voting rights. The fourth carried my signature from more than a decade earlier. Blake read fast, then slower, then again as if the words might rearrange themselves into a different life. Vanessa stared at the page without blinking. Thomas Reed spoke calmly. Nexera Systems operates under a multi-layer governance structure. The controlling voting authority is held by Whitmore Capital Trust. Blake frowned. So what? Thomas looked at him the way a judge looks at a man who has not yet understood the sentence. Richard Whitmore is the controlling trustee. The silence in that room had weight. Vanessa turned toward me. Her face had lost every trace of the woman who laughed in the ballroom. You control Nexera? She whispered. I control the votes that matter, I said. Board composition. Executive appointments. Major governance actions. Blake shook his head. That is impossible. Outside counsel answered before I did. It is fully documented and has been in place for more than 10 years. Vanessa's mouth opened, then closed. 20 years of marriage, and she had just discovered that the husband she dismissed as outdated controlled the company she used to impress another man. Blake recovered with anger because men like him often use anger when intelligence fails. This is a setup, he said. You planned this because you were jealous. Thomas leaned forward. No, Mr. Donovan. You created the conduct. Counsel documented it. The audit committee reviewed it. The board is responding to it. The audit chairman began reading formal recommendations. Immediate suspension pending independent investigation. Removal of executive system access. Review of vendor contracts. Compensation freeze. Conflict disclosure examination. Potential referral to outside regulators if financial misconduct was confirmed. Blake's face turned red. She was part of it, he said, pointing at Vanessa. She pushed the meetings. She wanted the access. Vanessa snapped back. You told me Richard was finished. You said nobody cared what he thought. Blake laughed bitterly. You were the one who said he was just an old man with old money. That landed hard. Not because it surprised me, but because it sounded exactly like her. Vanessa looked at me, horrified that her private contempt had become public record. Richard, I did not mean it that way. I looked at her without anger. You meant it clearly enough when you said it. Blake turned on her fully. Do not act innocent. You wanted the title. You wanted the trips. You wanted me standing beside you because he embarrassed you. Vanessa fired back. And you wanted my connections because you knew the board never respected you. That was the moment they stopped being partners and became witnesses against each other. Every sentence gave counsel more context. Every accusation added another thread. Thomas finally ordered both of them to stop. Security was asked to escort Blake out according to corporate procedure. Not for violence. For control of access and preservation of records. Blake stood so quickly his chair rolled back and struck the wall. Nobody followed him. Nobody defended him. The room that once applauded him now watched him leave under suspension. Vanessa remained seated, pale and silent. 30 minutes later, she too was placed under administrative review. When she passed me at the door, she whispered, Richard, please. I said only one thing. You should call your attorney. By the end of that afternoon, rumors had reached every executive floor. By evening, the press knew leadership changes were coming. And by the next morning, Blake Donovan learned that losing his job was only the first invoice. The fallout did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like paperwork, and paperwork can be far more permanent. Nexera announced an independent review of executive conduct and vendor approvals. Blake Donovan's suspension became termination for cause after the preliminary findings were confirmed. His compensation was frozen pending review. 2 vendors distanced themselves from him publicly. One former ally told a reporter that Blake had always been aggressive with boundaries, which is what corporate people say when they are trying to save themselves without sounding afraid. Outside counsel did not promise criminal charges. That would have been television, not real life. But they did preserve the right to refer findings if financial misconduct rose to that level. For Blake, that was enough. His reputation began collapsing before the investigation even finished. Vanessa's fall was quieter and more personal. Administrative review became resignation. Her name disappeared from panels. Invitations stopped. Colleagues who once admired her ambition stopped answering lunch requests. Men who once flattered her suddenly remembered they had families and compliance departments. The lifestyle she loved had depended on status, and status is not loyal when scandal enters the room. 3 weeks later, Vanessa came to the house carrying a folder. She looked beautiful in the way damaged things can still be beautiful, but the shine was gone. No designer dress. No polished performance. Just a woman standing at the gate of the life she had thrown away. I met her on the back patio. The bay was gray that morning, and the fog sat low over the hills. She placed the folder on the table. Divorce papers. Signed. I am sorry, she said. I looked at the folder, then back at her. For what? Her eyes filled. For all of it. For once, she did not perform. She admitted the emotional affair with Blake. She admitted the hotel weekends had crossed lines no marriage should survive. She admitted she liked being wanted by a younger, louder man. She admitted she had begun to see me as old, safe, and beneath the life she thought she deserved. I was stupid, she whispered. No, I said calmly. You were not stupid. You were willing. That hurt her more than shouting would have. She wiped her face. Blake used me. I shook my head. Blake showed you a door. You walked through it wearing my last name. She closed her eyes. Is there any chance we can start over? I looked at the woman I had loved for 20 years and finally saw her without hope attached. You did not lose me at the summit, I said. You lost me every time you laughed at something you should have stopped. You lost me every time you protected him instead of your marriage. Blake did not steal you from me, Vanessa. You traded yourself away. She broke then, quietly, without drama. I felt no joy in it. A man can win and still mourn the cost. I signed the final page and slid the folder back to her. The settlement was clean. The trust remained protected. The marriage ended without a courtroom spectacle because my attorney had prepared long before she decided to be sorry. Vanessa moved closer to her sister in Scottsdale. Blake spent the next year trying to rebuild a name people no longer trusted. I returned to quiet mornings, quiet investments, and rooms where nobody needed to know who held the votes. Sometimes people ask why I stayed silent so long. I tell them silence is only weakness when a man has no plan. When he has evidence, counsel, patience, and the law on his side, silence is strategy. In the end, the lesson was simple. You can dress betrayal in champagne, titles, hotel lobbies, and clever excuses, but the bill still comes due. And sooner or later, as Americans like to say, chickens come home to roost.